The autumn of 1944. The Recon forest on the German-Belgian frontier. A small German reconnaissance patrol crawls forward through the spruce trees in the pre-dawn cold. The men are Speer, scouts. Their orders are unambiguous. There's an American position one ridge over. It has been quiet for 36 hours. Find out who is in it. Find out how many. Find out what they intend to do next. This is what scouts do. Across 2,000 years of recorded military history, this is what they have always done. Get close, watch, listen, count. But here is what German reconnaissance patrols on the Western Front had specifically been trained to do. They were taught to look for the things the enemy had left behind. German military tradition called these the small signs. Kleinanzeichen, and a trained scout could read them the way a forensic pathologist reads a wound. A ration can with the 1st Infantry Division marking told you the big red one was here. A bandage wrapper with a manufacturer's stamp told you when. A vehicle track of a specific tread told you they came in by half track. A half-burned letter told you when they were last paid, and from what town. From these things, the German Ich, the intelligence officer at division level, built his picture of the enemy. The patrol that night in the Recon forest reached the American position. It has been held for several days. The Americans were gone. The ground was empty. The men looked around in the gray light, expecting to find what they had always found. They found nothing. Not less than expected. Nothing. The foxholes had been filled in. The slit trenches had been collapsed and covered. The ground had been raked. Whatever ration containers had been there were gone, buried or burned somewhere the scouts could not locate. No scraps of paper, no cigarette butts. The latrines had been filled and disguised with branches and leaves. No shoulder patches in any trash, because there was no trash. No letters from home, because the letters had been burned. The patrol returned to its lines and made its report. The IC officer who read that report would have done the only thing a competent intelligence officer can do when his scouts come back empty-handed. He would have asked, "Are you sure they were there?" Yes. There were traces of habitation, depressions in the leaves where men had slept, faint vehicle tracks at the road. Americans had been there, but who? Which division? Which regiment? In what strength? For how long? And going where? The scouts could not say. The ground could not say. Across the Western Front in 1944 and 1945, this kind of report came back to German intelligence officers again and again. The word that appears in post-war interrogations to describe their reaction is not anger and not frustration. It is a more specific word. The German word is rätselhaft, baffling, beyond reading. To understand why German scouts were baffled by something as mundane as a tidy field, and why baffled is the exactly correct word and not annoyed or impressed, we have to go back to a small office in the United States War Department on February 15th, 1940. 21 months before Pearl Harbor, to a 38-page manual that almost no popular history of the Second World War has ever mentioned by name. A manual that taught the United States Army how to be invisible to an enemy it had not yet met. Part 1. To understand why an empty American foxhole could break a German intelligence officer, you have to understand what a German intelligence officer was trained to do. The German army of the Second World War inherited a doctrine of ground reconnaissance that ran back through the Prussian General Staff to the Napoleonic Wars. The doctrine had 3 pillars: aerial reconnaissance, done by the Luftwaffe; signals intelligence, done by Kona regiments, the Army's radio interception units; and ground reconnaissance, done by the Speer, the Aufklärer, the Erkunder, the Scouts. Ground scouts were not a sideshow in this picture. They were the eyes of the Army at the tactical level. A division commander, sitting in his headquarters with his IC officer, drew his picture of the enemy from 3 sources: what the Luftwaffe could photograph from the air, what signal intercepts could pluck from the airwaves, and what scouts on the ground could see, touch, and bring back. Of these 3, the men on foot were the most intimate. The Luftwaffe could see a vehicle column on a road. Signals intelligence could pick up a radio call, but only a scout could walk into a position the enemy had just left and read it like a book. There was even a German military phrase for what a scout was supposed to do when he reached an abandoned enemy position. The phrase was Spuren Sichern, to secure traces, to gather signs, to document evidence. The signs the scouts hunted fell into 4 categories. Identification, anything that named the enemy unit, a shoulder patch in trash, a letter fragment with a return address, a ration tin with a depot code. Strength, anything that suggested numbers. Latrine size, the footprint of slept-on ground. Intent, anything that suggested where they had gone. Vehicle track direction, whether the position had been hastily abandoned or methodically vacated. And condition, anything that suggested morale, the contents of an unburned letter, the marks of fingernails dug into earthen walls during shelling. From these signs, a competent IC officer filled in a map. From the map, he gave his commander an estimate. From the estimate, the division moved. This was tradecraft. It was old. It had worked. On the Eastern Front, it worked spectacularly. Soviet units left mountains of evidence, Red Army cigarette papers, issues of Pravda, Cyrillic-marked ration cans, photographs of wives and children, identity documents. German scouts on the Eastern Front rarely returned with nothing. Then the German army encountered the Americans. It happened first in Tunisia in 1942 and 1943, then in Sicily and Italy, then in Normandy, the long retreat through France, and finally the Withdrawal and the Recon. By the autumn of 1944, German intelligence officers had been encountering American units on and off for nearly 2 years. The same observation kept appearing in their reports. The Americans were different. American positions, when captured or evacuated, yielded substantially less identification material than positions left behind by any other Allied force. The Italians had left mountains, the British a great deal, the French less. The Americans left almost nothing. German officers did not yet know why. They suspected naturally that this was either an accident of geography, perhaps American supply was so abundant the men didn't bother with personal effects, or a kind of unusual cleanliness, the fastidiousness of a society that put a high value on hygiene. The idea that an entire army had been deliberately drilled, for years before Pearl Harbor, in the specific tradecraft of denying a German intelligence officer his data, that idea did not occur to them. It did not occur to them for a reason. The reason matters. We will come back to it. For now, hold this thought. A German scout walks into an empty American foxhole in 1944. He has been trained for years to read what he finds. He finds nothing. He carries that nothing back to his IC officer. The IC officer carries it forward to the division commander. And the division commander, sitting before his map in the candlelight of a French chateau or a Belgian farmhouse, has to make a decision about where the Americans are going to be tomorrow. With no data, what does he do? He guesses. He guesses with what he has. He guesses badly. In Italy, in France, in Belgium, and finally in Germany itself, the cumulative effect of all those bad guesses would shape every decision the German army made on the Western Front. The decision to hold a position, the decision to retreat, the decision to commit a reserve, the decision in December 1944 to send hundreds of thousands of men into the Ardennes against an enemy whose strength the IRC officers had badly underestimated. The Ardennes intelligence failure has many fathers, but one of them is buried in the topsoil of a foxhole somewhere in the Recon forest, where an American sergeant had filled it in before he marched away. Of all the things German scouts had been taught to find, the one thing they had never been taught to interpret was absence. The German doctrine had no concept of absence as a deliberate weapon. Spur and Sickern assumed that traces existed. When they did not exist, the doctrine had nothing to say. And we still have not gotten to the question of where the discipline came from. Because if you were to ask the average GI in 1944 whether he was personally executing a sophisticated counterintelligence strategy when he filled in his foxhole, he would have looked at you blankly and said no. He was just policing his area, because his sergeant had told him to, because that was Army. But where did the Army learn it? And when? That is where this story actually begins. Part 2. You can find it today in a library at San Diego State University in folder 57, box 4 of the Francis M. Woolburn Papers. It is the 38-page paper-bound booklet with the War Department seal on the cover. The full title is Basic Field Manual. Military Intelligence, Counterintelligence. The serial number is FM30-25. The date on the cover is February 15th, 1940. In February 1940, the United States Army numbered fewer than 200,000 men. Hitler had been at war for less than 5 months. Pearl Harbor was 21 months in the future. America was officially neutral. The country was, as it had been for most of its history, indifferent to its own military. And in a small office of the War Department in Washington, a small staff of officers in the G2 section, Army Intelligence, was putting the final touches on a manual whose subject was something almost no one outside that office cared about: counterintelligence. Read the table of contents and you see what the authors thought mattered. Section 2, Secrecy Discipline. Section 5, Preparation and Use of Documents. Section 7, Movements of Troops and Individuals. Section 9, Censorship. The most important sections for our story are Section 2 and Section 7. Inside Section 2, the manual sets out a principle so deceptively simple that it took the rest of the world's armies until the 1950s to formally adopt it. The principle is that secrecy is not the job of a separate intelligence service. It is the job of every soldier, every day. A modern reader has to pause on that, because it is not how most armies have ever worked. In the Wehrmacht, in the Red Army, in the British Army, for most of its history, secrecy was something officers and intelligence personnel did. A sergeant and his squad were responsible for their weapons and their orders. The big picture intelligence game was for other people. The 1940 manual said otherwise. It said secrecy was a discipline, like firing the rifle, like saluting, like keeping your boots dry. Every soldier was a participant in the counterintelligence battle, whether he understood the battle or not, simply by virtue of what he did and did not leave behind. Section 7 contained a paragraph that is the doctrinal seed for everything we have been describing. The paragraph was titled, in Army Deadpan, Precautions Prior to Departure. It instructed that before any unit moved out of an area, the unit would erase or conceal evidence of its identity, its strength, and its intentions. Foxholes filled, trash buried or burned, documents accounted for, equipment markings concealed. The wording was unsexy. The implication was vast. You might ask, did anyone actually read this manual in February 1940? Honest answer, very few people. It was distributed in small numbers. There was no mass training program built around it yet. There was no war. But here is the thing about doctrine documents in a peacetime army. They become the curriculum. When the Army began its massive expansion after September 1940, from 200,000 men to over 1 million in a single year, and then on to 8 million by 1945, the manuals written in that small G2 office in Washington became the syllabus for training cadres across the country. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, every soldier in basic training was being told, somewhere in his first weeks, that policing the area was not a chore invented to torment him. It was a counterintelligence operation he and his comrades were running against an enemy he had not yet met. The discipline expanded. In the Soldier's Handbook, FM 21-100, published December 11, 1940, Chapter 11 covered marches, camps, and bivouacs. The chapter took it for granted that no American unit would leave a bivouac without policing it. 25 years before Leave No Trace became a slogan of the American hiking community, it was already the operating principle of the American Infantry Division. There is a phrase you sometimes hear from veterans of that era. The Army taught me to pick up after myself. They usually say it with affection or rueful humor. They are not always aware that the discipline they are remembering, the police call, the filled foxhole, the burned letter, the field strip cigarette, was a deliberate institutional decision made in 1940 by men preparing for a war they had not yet been allowed to fight. The question that remains is whether the doctrine, beautiful on paper, would survive contact with real soldiers, real fatigue, real fear, and real combat. Because doctrine is one thing, a frozen G all ice in a Belgian forest at midnight, who has not slept in 72 hours and is told by his sergeant to fill in his foxhole before they march, is something else entirely. The miracle of the discipline is not that it was written, it is that it held. The The men who built and held this system did not write memoirs. They did not get movies. They worked mostly in obscurity, executing a strategic operation they themselves did not fully understand. If you found this part of the story worth thinking about, hit the like button. It helps surface the kind of history that does not make it into the textbooks. The small, repeated, unglamorous decisions that decided more battles than most of the famous ones. Part 3. There's a small ritual that almost every American soldier of World War II describes in his memoir, often without realizing it is the protagonist of our story. It happens before a unit moves out of an occupied area. Sometimes it happens because higher headquarters has ordered a withdrawal. Sometimes because the unit is rotating to the rear. Sometimes because the line is being reorganized. The reason does not matter. The ritual does. The sergeant gives the order. Police the area. 2 words. Inside those 2 words, an enormous amount of work. Foxholes filled in with the dirt that had come out of them, the dirt packed down with a boot. Slit trenches collapsed. Latrines covered, the contents under at least 2 feet of topsoil, the topsoil sometimes scuffed with a branch to remove the obvious cut of a shovel, trash collected, K-ration boxes, those waxed boxes that an experienced German scout could spot at 50 paces, folded flat and either burned or buried, C-ration cans punctured to prevent rolling, then buried, cigarette butts not just discarded but field stripped, the paper torn open, the tobacco scattered by hand, the paper rolled between thumb and forefinger into a pellet, smaller than a grain of rice. The pellet would not survive a single rain. Letters were the difficult part. A letter from a wife or girlfriend or a mother is the most informationally dense object a soldier carries. It has a return address. It has dates. It often contains, despite censorship, references to a soldier's posting and to people in his unit. A single intact letter found in a German scout's hand and carried back to an IC officer could in principle compromise a battalion. The discipline, therefore, was letters were not to be discarded. Letters were to be burned on a small individual basis and the ashes scattered. Or in the case of withdrawal under pressure, they were to be left with the unit's mail clerk for evacuation. They were never to be thrown away. A young Wisconsin paratrooper named John B. Jack Cummings, with Company A of the 276th Infantry Regiment, would learn the discipline on the banks of the Rhine River on December 29, 1944. According to a memoir by one of his fellow A Company veterans, Frank H. Lowry, the men of Company A were told as they took up the positions along the river that they were to get rid of any letters and remove their unit patches. The reason given was simple. If they were captured, the enemy was not to learn what unit had crossed. This is a small detail, easily overlooked. The men were not told to remove their patches when they marched into combat in general. They were told to remove them because they were about to be in a place where capture was a specific and elevated risk. The order was tactical. It was specific. It was rehearsed. Cummings was killed on New Year's Eve, alone in his foxhole, armed with a Browning automatic rifle. A German raiding party crossed the Rhine that night. Cummings vanished. Only his helmet, with a bullet hole through it, was found. His body would not be identified for 74 years. One of the reasons identification took that long, according to the Army's own post-war reports, was precisely that he and his comrades had carried out the procedure they had been ordered to carry out. He had no patches. He had no letters. The body the Germans found and buried across the river had nothing on it to indicate which American unit he had belonged to. The discipline that protected the unit by denying the enemy information had also, in a small and tragic way, made it harder for Cummings' family to bring him home. Multiply this practice across an entire army. Multiply it across 2 years of combat. The cumulative effect is the disappearance of an entire informational ecosystem. A German scout who walked into an abandoned American foxhole in 1944 was not failing to find evidence because the Americans were lucky or sloppy. He was failing because every American he was searching for had been drilled for as long as a year and a half before he ever boarded a ship, in the precise, small motions that erased the kind of signs the scout had been trained to read. Field strip the cigarette, bury the can, burn the box, fill the hole, cover the latrine, remove the patch, pocket the letter. 12 words. The entire counterintelligence campaign of the United States Army on the Western Front, condensed. Was the discipline universal? Of course not. Some units were lazier than others, some sergeants stricter than others. Some battalions, in the chaos of fast withdrawals, left their positions in haste and left more behind than they should have. There are German intelligence reports that capture, with a kind of quiet delight, the rare American foxhole that had been imperfectly policed. The IC officers fell on those reports like wolves, because such reports were the exception. The rule, across most of the Western Front, was the empty field. And here is the part that I think matters most. The Americans were not aware that they were waging a counterintelligence campaign. They thought they were keeping their kit clean. They thought they were just policing their area. The institutional layer that had taught them the discipline and the institutional layer that had decided why the discipline mattered were almost completely opaque to the soldiers carrying it out. That opacity was, in its own way, a strength. A man executes a strategic operation reliably when he does not know he is executing one. He just does what his sergeant says. The Germans, meanwhile, were trying to read fields that had been swept by 12 million janitors who did not know they were custodians of an intelligence operation. The question that still hangs over this is why the Germans, with their formidable intelligence apparatus and their long experience on the Eastern Front, could not adapt. Why didn't they tell their own troops to do the same thing? Why didn't they catch up? The answer is that they tried. They could not. Part 4. There's a temptation, when telling stories like this one, to make the enemy look stupid. It is a temptation a careful historian resists, because the German intelligence services of the Second World War were not stupid. They were sophisticated, technically advanced, and staffed by professionals. So why couldn't they replicate the American secrecy discipline? There are 3 reasons, and each illustrates a different fact about the war. The first reason is structural. The Wehrmacht's reconnaissance and counterintelligence doctrines were organized around different assumptions. German doctrine put the burden of secrecy on units at the operational and strategic levels, on staffs, on headquarters, on intelligence specialists. Field soldiers carried out tactical security tasks like camouflage and march discipline. But the systematic, automatic, every soldier, everyday practice that the Americans had built out of FM30-25 was not part of the German training pipeline. This was not because the Germans had not thought of it. It was because, for most of the war on the Eastern Front, they had not needed to. The Soviet Union's vast scale and rapid mobilization meant that Red Army units were, on the whole, less disciplined about leaving signs. German scouts on the Eastern Front could rely on traces. The intelligence ecosystem ran. There was no operational pressure to invent a different way. When the Germans encountered American units in North Africa in 1942 and 1943, they noticed the difference. They read it as an oddity. Americans were richer, with more supply, less attached to their personal effects, more casual about what they threw away. The German intelligence community wrote about it, but it did not occur to them that the entire system was deliberate. The second reason is documentary. By April 1943, the German army had begun to remove unit markings from vehicles in the east. The Heeresgruppe Mitte Directive of April 25, 1943, the precursor to what historians today call the Kursk Markings Order. But this was a fix applied at the level of vehicles, not at the level of the soldier in the bivouac, and it was applied because German intelligence officers had begun to fear that Soviet reconnaissance, finally improving, would use the markings to track German divisions. The order, in other words, was reactive. It was not part of a doctrine taught from basic training upward. The German spare who walked into an empty American foxhole had nothing comparable to FM 30-25 in his own kit bag. There was no Wehrmacht equivalent of precautions prior to departure as a standalone training topic at the squad level. The third reason is cultural. This is harder to talk about precisely because cultural explanations are often wrong. But the testimony of post-war German interrogations is unanimous on one point. Wehrmacht units left things behind. Letters from home, photographs, identity documents on the dead, diaries. Many German soldiers kept extensive diaries, which is one reason American interrogators were so successful with German prisoners. Allied intelligence built much of its order of battle data on the Western Front by reading German diaries and letters captured in the field. Put these three reasons together: doctrine that did not push secrecy down to the soldier, vehicle markings reactively concealed but bivouac markings still intact, a culture that preserved personal effects. The result was not a military disaster on its own. The Germans could and did win battles, but it meant that in the asymmetric intelligence war, the German OIC officer was always going to be looking up at the American OIC officer's information from below, and the data confirms this. In November 1942, the British Western Front Committee at Bletchley Park began producing systematic order of battle assessments of German forces in the West. By D-Day, on June 6, 1944, the committee had identified all 58 German divisions stationed in France and the Low Countries. Everyone, the Germans, with all their effort, had no equivalent against the Allies. American troop strengths in southern England before D-Day were systematically underestimated by German intelligence. Patton's Ghost First Army Group, sitting in Kent, eating tea sandwiches and broadcasting fake radio traffic, was believed real until well after the Normandy landings had actually broken out of the bocage. The Ardennes Offensive of December 1944 was launched, in part, on a German estimate of American strength behind the front lines that was wildly low. Hitler believed there was a thin, fragile screen between him and Antwerp. Some of that estimate was based on signals intelligence, some on aerial reconnaissance, what the badly attrited Luftwaffe could still provide. But a substantial portion was based on the silence of the ground reports. The German IC officers in the West, by late 1944, had stopped trusting their scouts. The reports were too thin. The blanks were too large. The maps were too speculative. Here is where I want you to pause and let the asymmetry sink in. The Western Allies, by late 1944, had a near-complete picture of the German order of battle in France and Germany. The Germans, in the same theater, were guessing. They were guessing not because their scouts were lazy, but because the men they sent forward were being asked to read fields that had been deliberately wiped clean of everything they had been trained to read. The German IC officer's word for what his scouts were bringing back was a German word that translates poorly into English. The closest equivalents are baffling, inexplicable, beyond reading. The same kind of word would surface in the prisoner of war debriefings at Camp Ritchie, where the Hill Project, almost 200 captured Wehrmacht officers working under American supervision in 1945 and 1946, tried to reconstruct the German military picture of the war. The Hill Project records contain, in the careful language of professional military men, the same wonder. We could not see them. We did not know what we were looking at. The ground we walked over was bare. That bareness is the answer to the title's puzzle. Why baffled and not just frustrated? Because frustration is what you feel when an obstacle is in your way. Bafflement is what you feel when there is nothing in your way at all, and yet you still cannot see. This is what made it baffling rather than just difficult. The Germans, for years, looked at empty American foxholes and tried to figure out what kind of trick they were seeing. They suspected sabotage of evidence. They suspected deliberate planting of false signs. They suspected that the Americans were so wealthy in equipment that they did not carry their personal effects with them. They reached for every interpretation their doctrine allowed. What they could not reach was the simple, almost domestic answer. The Americans had been told to pick up after themselves. If your father or grandfather served in the European theater, in an infantry division, in the cavalry, in an engineer or signal or quartermaster unit, I would be honored to read his story in the comments. What unit? Did he ever mention what it felt like to police a position before moving out? The voices of the men who actually did the work are not in most of the histories. They belong here. Part 5. There is an Army term that does not appear in the official histories often enough. The term is the police call. You can find it today in any Army veteran's vocabulary. It is a small, sometimes derided ritual. A platoon spreads out across an area in a long line shoulder to shoulder, walking forward slowly, picking up everything that is not part of the ground. Cigarette butts, bottle caps, bits of paper, twigs, anything. The line moves at the pace of a thoughtful child looking for shells on a beach. When the area is clean, the police call is finished. The exercise is sometimes assigned with a small smile to soldiers being punished. Veterans tell stories about it with the affection of people remembering a chore that turned out, against expectation, to be slightly meaningful. The police call is not glamorous. It does not appear in war movies. There's no Audie Murphy scene of a police call. The ritual sits below the notice of popular memory. It is one of the most quietly important rituals in American military history, because for the 4 years of the Second World War, the police call was the United States Army's primary tactical counterintelligence operation, executed by every infantryman, every clerk, every artilleryman, every signal operator, every cook in every theater, every day. It denied a foreign intelligence service the data it needed to do its job. It did this without ever telling the soldiers carrying it out that this was what they were doing. They thought they were just picking up trash. So let us answer, at last, the question this video began with. Why were German scouts baffled by American units leaving no traces? The shallow answer is that the men sent forward could not find the data they needed to identify the unit, count its strength, or trace its direction. That answer is true, but not enough. It explains why they failed. It does not explain why baffled is the right word. The full answer is that German military reconnaissance was a system that depended, in its tradecraft and in its cultural assumptions, on the natural untidiness of soldiers. Soldiers leave things behind. They always have. Across thousands of years of recorded military history, the abandoned camp has been a gold mine for the careful enemy. The Roman scout, the Mongol rider, the Napoleonic dragoon, the Boer commando. Every reconnaissance tradition on Earth has rested on this assumption. Soldiers leave things behind. The scout reads what they left. A doctrine that broke that assumption did not just produce a difficult intelligence environment, it produced an intelligence environment that German tradecraft had no category to describe. There was no playbook for the enemy will leave nothing. A patrol returning empty-handed was, in the German intelligence framework, not a patrol that had encountered a difficult opponent. It was a patrol that had failed its task. The system blamed the men when the men were actually facing a deliberately engineered void. And here is what the cause and effect verb of the title really means. The Germans were baffled, in the strictest sense, because what they were encountering was outside their interpretive grammar. You cannot reason your way out of an absence if your reasoning method requires presence. You cannot interpret what is not there. This is also why the discipline scaled, because the soldiers carrying it out did not know they were carrying out a strategic operation. They did not become fatigued by the strategic weight of it. They were just picking up after themselves. They were just policing the area. They did it tired. They did it scared. They did it in the rain. They did it in the snow. They did it because the sergeant said so. They did it because the manual said so. They did it for 4 years across 2 oceans and 3 continents. And the cumulative effect was that on the Western Front, in the most consequential intelligence theater of the 20th century, the German Wehrmacht's RC officers stopped being able to see the American army with any reliability at all. By December 1944, when Hitler launched the Ardennes offensive, the German intelligence picture of American strength in the Ardennes sector was wrong by orders of magnitude. German commanders believed they faced a thin and brittle American line. They actually faced, within 72 hours of the offensive's start, the better part of 9 American divisions, with more arriving daily. The intelligence misestimate had many causes. Bad assumptions about American command and control, a breakdown in German signal interception caused by the Allies' use of buried landline communications in the West, an over-reliance on the few German agents still operating behind Allied lines. But one of the causes was simpler than all of these. It was the police call, multiplied by 4 years, multiplied by 12 million GIs. A scout sent forward to look at the American Ardennes sector in December 1944, hunting for the kind of ground-level traces that would have told him which divisions were where, was looking at fields that had been filled in by men trained for years in the small motions of erasure. The men who wrote FM30-25 in February 1940 will not be in any movie. They are not in any famous photograph. Their names are buried in the masthead of an obsolete government document. But for 4 years, The doctrine they wrote was carried out by millions of young men who did not know whose work they were finishing. There is a verdict in this story, and it is not the verdict the title might lead you to expect. The verdict is not that the Americans were smarter or cleaner than the Germans. The Germans were extraordinarily disciplined and extraordinarily smart. The verdict is that the Americans had decided early enough that the decision matured before they fought, that secrecy was the job of every soldier, every day, in every small motion. This is a different verdict from the Allies won because they were richer, or the Allies won because they outproduced their enemies. Those are also true. But the war was decided in many small theaters, and one of those theaters was an empty foxhole in the Hurtgen forest on a cold morning in November 1944, where a German reconnaissance patrol stood looking around and finding nothing. The Germans were baffled because their tradecraft had been engineered to read what soldiers leave behind. The American sergeants had been trained since 1940 to leave nothing behind. The men sent forward did not need a brilliant deception. They just needed an order they had been hearing since basic training. Police the area, 2 words, across a continent, for 4 years, by 12 million men. If this story moved you, if you found in it something about the work soldiers do that does not make it into the movies, hit the like button. It helps this channel reach the people who care about the way the war was actually fought, by ordinary men doing small, repeated things. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember this, we tend to remember war as a story of great engines, great generals, great battles. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it is the story of a man in a frozen field, scuffing his boot over the dirt where his foxhole had been, because that was what he had been told to do. The men who held the line did not always hold it with a rifle. Sometimes they held it with a shovel. And the silence they left behind, silence so complete that the enemy could not read it, was its own form of victory. War is mathematics, but it is also janitorial. The men who picked up after themselves on 100 battlefields you and I have never heard of made the decisions of their generals possible. They deserve to be remembered for it, even though they were never told that this was what they were doing.